So you might think that the drama of Emily's life ended when she passed away. However, it continued due to a rather strange series of circumstances. Um, you remember that the Dickinson homestead is next door to Austin and Susan's house. So at the time that Emily died, um, people began to realize after the poems were found that she might turn into someone of note that would be remembered for a long time. And so there was some conversation about what would happen to the homestead. So there were three children born to Austin and Susan's marriage. Ned, the youngest, who was Dickinson's favorite, passed away fairly young. An older brother also died at a fairly young age before he was married, and that left one daughter who named Martha Dickinson Bianchi, and she married but never had children. So she employed a private secretary who had been a graduate of Harvard, and when she died, she willed the Evergreens to Harvard, whereas the Dickinsons, both Edward and Austin had attended Amherst, willed the homestead to Amherst College. So now we have this weird situation in which Harvard owns the Evergreens, Amherst owns the homestead, and there's no conversation happening between them. And for decades, Harvard did very little to maintain or preserve what was in the Evergreens, and they did not open it to the public. So only in the last 15 years or so, when I was at Amherst, this was not the case. Harvard reopened the Evergreens and began to look through the archives and see what was there. And then they determined that they were willing to partner with the Amherst College to figure out how to create a united homestead between the two houses and the story that exists between them. And that development resulted in the digitization of both Harvard and Amherst collections. They each had a huge amount of original work. Whatever had been in Susan and then Martha's possession ended up in the Harvard collection. And now it is possible online to access virtually every artifact, whether it's through Harvard or through Amherst. And in fact, in New York City right now, there is a massive joint exhibition of ephemera and memorabilia from Dickinson's life. That exhibition is through, I believe, the 21st of May, and I'm going to go see it over our April vacation, but my understanding is that it's absolutely fantastic. So now Amherst has the primary rights to the homestead and the Evergreens. You can visit them both now. You can go inside the Evergreens for the first time in almost a century, see what it was like there. They've beautifully brought it back to life. One of my favorite rooms is the nursery, where there are still paintings on the walls and you can see the old wallpaper, and they really have done a beautiful job. Remember, the Dickinson homestead was built much earlier, so that's been kept in a more traditional colonial style. The Evergreens, which was built as an Italianate revival, has a much heavier, darker Victorian look to it, I would say, but really neat to see them both because you can also see what Austin and Susan's life was like. So two things I'd like to leave you with before I go. The first one is this very beautiful poem, one of her most famous, that I'd like you to talk about. The first sort of line has become one of the most famous descriptions of how Dickinson saw the world. And remember, 320 means it was written fairly early on from the 1800 poems. This would have been before the Civil War, and giving us a sense of what her world was like earlier in her perceptions. There's a certain slant of light, winter afternoons, that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us. We can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are, none may teach it. 'Tis the sealed despair, an imperial affliction sent us of the air. When it comes, the landscape listens, shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. So I like the idea that in the short days of winter, there is this moment where the northern light is filtered through her windows. And remember, she has that beautiful view of Susan and Austin's house. And I've always wondered why she didn't choose a bedroom on the other side facing the garden. But if we imagine for a minute that she's there in that window at the small table writing on a winter afternoon, it isn't uplifting to her to see that light. It is something that oppresses her. And I love that comparison to the cathedral tunes, those heavy organ notes, and describing it as a kind of pain that comes, and yet not one that you can see visibly, but one that on the inside gives you a pain that doesn't really that goes beyond a description she can provide other than by analogy or metaphor. And I particularly like the idea that no one except yourself, none may teach it, can fully understand it. So she can discuss it here, but only you yourself can understand its weight and sort of how it bears upon you in that moment. I always think of it as before the 21st of December, as the winter is getting heavier and the days shorter, before the hope that emerges after that as we head towards spring. And as you probably know, she has countless springtime poems that represent a more hopeful sensibility. And then I'll note too here the formal rhyme scheme. So much of her poetry rhymes A, B, C, B. So you have light, afternoons, heft, tunes. And when we talked the other day about regularization and how the publishers wanted it to appear like she was writing in a very strict meter and rhyme, this type of earlier poem and permitted them to kind of shove it into that rhyme scheme. But I would point out, if you look at some of the other poems, she uses a great deal of half rhyme or slant rhyme, where in 632 she says possibility, prose, windows, doors. So you have a similar sound there, but not a full rhyme. And that's a very unusual thing to do at her time. It isn't a common practice until decades after her death to have that kind of half rhyme or slant rhyme. You would be expected to have a much more formal, like the rhyme scheme above, light, afternoons, heft, tunes. Similarly, 435, much madness is divinest sense to a discerning eye, much sense the starkest madness, 'tis the majority. And no, she didn't say 'tis the majority. So there's what we also call an I rhyme, EYE, meaning that if you look at the word I in majority, you see those Y's and you think, oh, maybe that has a more similar sound, same as prose and doors with that S near the end. But for her to do that I know it sounds kind of silly, it's an act of poetic rebellion in that she really is exploring the way in which the exact words she means may be a better match than the rhymed word to the poetry she's writing. And to push that envelope at a time that, if you think about Shakespeare, where in his iambic pentameter, he would shove these really weird phrases backwards and sort of inverted on themselves to make them match the rhythm and the rhyme, or the meter and the rhyme, she refuses to do that much of the time. And that's kind of a neat window into her sensibility that either she would never be published or that she was going to redefine poetry by her own terms or in her own terms. And I love that piece about her. It's kind of a neat place, I think, to end in talking about the formal style. But I'll leave you with this, which is my absolute favorite Dickinson poem, and one that I think speaks to many, many people about what it's like to have a period of sadness or a period of depression and how you emerge from that. On the left-hand side is the original in part, and the really sort of beautiful imagery she offers. I always think of it as a description of the way that she crosses the yard over to Susan and Austin's house, or back to her own home from their home to hers in the evening. Look at it as an extended metaphor for the way in which this stumbling walk back through the darkness and then the emergence at the other side in a place of safety makes a wonderful comparison to the experience of emerging from a period of sadness or a period of depression. 419. We grow accustomed to the dark when light is put away, as when the neighbor holds the lamp to witness her goodbye. A moment we uncertain step for newness of the night, then fit our vision to the dark and meet the road erect. And so of larger darknesses, those evenings of the brain when not a moon disclose a sign or star come out within, the bravest grope a little and sometimes hit a tree directly in the forehead. But as they learn to see, either the darkness alters or something in the sight adjusts itself to midnight, and life steps almost straight. So if you think about those first two stanzas as a literal description, you have this difficulty in figuring out the way you're going to go. But then the larger darknesses, the evenings of the brain, no light, no sense that you're going to make it out of that period of darkness. And there's those people who are willing to try it out. And when they do, I love this idea that they sometimes hit a tree directly in the forehead, those brave people, try and fail. But from that, they either begin to be able to navigate it because the darkness alters. In other words, a light emerges externally. Perhaps someone at your home pulls out a lantern so you can see your way, or your eyesight adjusts to the darkness and you can begin to see that way. So either the darkness itself is altered or your vision in the darkness alters. And to me, that's such a powerful image of how we might explore the process of coming out of a depression and how we might figure a way out of something that would be such a challenging period in one's life. So I leave you with that. Such a beautiful conclusion, I think, to an observation or a reflection on Dickinson's poetry in her life. And thank you so much for the opportunity to meet you all and to talk a little bit about my favorite poet. If you have questions or you want to talk further, don't hesitate to be in touch. On Twitter, my handle is mainschooltech, or my email is mainschooltech@gmail.com. And I'll look forward to hearing from you if there's anything I can offer. And as I said, get down to New York if you have a chance and see the extraordinary exhibit that's there, or anything in the permanent collection in Amherst. As I said, you can visit the Homestead and the Evergreens on a joint ticket now. And then also about 3 blocks away, you can visit the primary collection, which is stored in Amherst's Robert Frost Library, another famous Amherst poet. And there's always a permanent exhibition there of her work in the original form that you can see. And finally, the extraordinary digital collections that exist. So you can look at, as far as I know, almost everything, whether through Amherst's collection or through Harvard's. Have a great afternoon and drive safely.